All right, so you know how sometimes when you think back to some of like your favorite moments in gaming,
Hmm.
it's the music that like really brings it all back.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking for me and probably a lot of our listeners, it's composers like, Jeremy Soule,
Oh, yeah.
The Elder Scrolls or Jesper Kid Assassin's Creed.
Sure.
And those are like huge names, right?
Absolutely.
But for me personally, having spent so much time in like the original Fallout games, Fallout 2, and
Yeah.
even Planescape, Torment,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
there's another name that kind of comes to mind first, and that's Mark Morgan.
Absolutely. And you know what's interesting about him? He's not like maybe a household name to the average person on the street,
Right.
but when you get into the gaming community, his impact on, immersive soundtracks and like the emotional connection with soundtracks,
Yeah.
oh man, it's just legendary.
Right.
And what's really cool about Mark Morgan is like he's done so much more than just video game music. I mean, he's got experience in television, he's got experience in film.
Yeah.
He was even in the band Starship for a little while.
Really?
Yeah, so it's really interesting to kind of get to look at his career.
Yeah, and to see how all these different like kind of threads of genres and styles
Yeah.
really, I mean, obviously influenced how he approached video game music.
Absolutely. And for anyone out there listening, who is aspiring to be, a game music composer,
Mm-hmm.
this is going to be a really insightful dive.
Yeah, this is a great one.
Yeah, so let's get into it.
So it's interesting how he even got into game music.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't like he was like, I want to score video games, and that's what he did.
No, not at all.
It was actually kind of by chance.
Yeah, so a friend of his, an agent, heard some of the music that he had done for a TV show
Oh. Okay.
back in the mid-90s called Prey.
Oh,
And the agent thought, this stuff would be great for video games.
interesting. Okay.
And so he like passed around to some developers
Oh, wow.
and they loved it.
Right. So it was this TV show Prey that kind of led him into...
That was the catalyst.
Yeah.
That brought him into the video game world.
Wow, okay.
And then he realized once he got into that world that like, wow, this is really cool.
Yeah.
It allows me to kind of really explore my interest in writing music that is minimal,
Okay.
very immersive,
Mm-hmm.
and to really put the player emotionally inside the game.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, especially for the time, right?
Right.
Like, that was not common.
No.
I mean, what comes to mind, when I think about Mark Morgan's work is are the scores for the original Fallout and Planescape.
Torment.
Absolutely.
Oh.
Two of his most iconic games.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because those development teams, specifically moved away from having traditional orchestral scores.
Yes, exactly.
What you would expect for fantasy
Right.
role-playing games.
Right.
They wanted something very, very different, and Morgan delivered that.
Absolutely.
He described the Fallout music as being very dark ambient,
Yeah.
and for Planescape. Torment, he said it was more thematic.
Yeah. But still rooted in an ambient place.
Right.
It's about the story. It's not about like overpowering melodies.
Exactly, yeah. He wanted to be subtle enough to not intrude, but bold enough to not become irrelevant.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he didn't want it to take you out of the game,
Mhm.
but he didn't want it to just be, wallpaper either.
Yeah, and it's so cool because like this approach, it wasn't just him being like, oh, this is my style.
Right.
He's talked about this before. He was influenced by minimalist and modernist architecture.
Interesting.
Like the use of space and kind of this focus on the essential.
Yeah, you can see that reflected in his music.
Yeah, it's like he's trying to affect the player subliminally,
Yeah.
and keep them really locked into the moment.
Yeah, and not distract them with, a big orchestra hitting a big chord every 2 seconds.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how did this guy who's, scoring these iconic video games,
Yeah,
how did he get to this point?
right.
What's his background like?
Yeah, well, like a lot of musicians, he started very early. Started taking piano lessons at age 7.
Okay.
So he was immersed in classical music for a good portion of his young life.
All right, so he's got this really strong musical foundation then.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And then, as a lot of musicians do as they get older, their tastes broaden a little bit.
Yeah.
So he got into rock and roll in high school,
Okay.
started playing in garage bands,
Nice.
and then later on he really got interested in jazz.
Okay.
And that actually led him to enroll at Berklee College of Music in Boston.
Wow. Okay.
But he didn't actually finish Berklee.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, I know. He really just wanted to perform.
Okay.
So he left to become a studio musician.
Okay, so that kind of set him on a really interesting career path then.
It did. Yeah, I mean, he was playing with some really big names.
Yeah.
One of his early gigs was with Chaka Khan.
Oh, wow.
So he got a tour with her. He got to play with a bunch of other artists.
Yeah.
Eventually became a member of the band Starship.
Starship.
Yeah.
Wow, okay. That's quite a departure from, dark ambient video game music.
It is. But it's also a really important part of his development as a composer
Okay.
because he started to really hone his songwriting and producing skills.
Oh, within Starship. Okay.
Yeah, he was writing and producing songs for the band.
Okay.
So even though it was in a more pop rock kind of a genre,
Yeah.
it gave him the experience to kind of really learn the craft of, putting together songs.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
So,
So from there, then what happened?
well, from there he moved from the San Francisco Bay Area down to Los Angeles.
Okay.
And that's where he really got into television composing.
Okay. How did that happen?
Well, he knew Snuffy Walden from when he was playing with Chaka Khan.
Okay.
And Snuffy Walden had transitioned into doing music for television,
Okay.
and he needed a keyboard player.
Okay.
So he brought Mark in.
Right.
And at that point, Mark had been listening to a lot of film scores and more experimental music.
Okay.
So he was kind of primed for that kind of work,
Okay.
where you're composing to picture.
Right.
Yeah. And it just kind of felt like a natural progression for him.
And so through that, then, did he get his own show?
Yeah, eventually he landed his own show.
Okay.
It was called Prey.
Ah, okay, so that's the one.
Yeah, that's the one that led to the video game stuff.
Okay, so it's kind of all coming full circle now.
It is, yeah.
I mean, that's so cool. So it's like
Yeah.
classical piano, rock and roll,
Jazz.
jazz TV composing,
Yeah.
and then finally video games.
It all kind of came together.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's not just his own musical history that shaped his sound.
Okay.
He's also been influenced by a lot of different artists.
Okay, like who?
He's mentioned Peter Gabriel,
Okay.
Ryuichi Sakamoto,
Yeah.
Clint Mansell,
Oh, wow.
9 Inch Nails,
Okay.
David Sylvian, Massive Attack, even Miles Davis.
Wow. That's a huge range.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, but what they all have in common is this ability to evoke emotion
Yeah.
and a willingness to experiment with sound.
Right.
And I think you can hear that in Mark's music too.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how he actually puts this music together. Like,
Yeah.
what's his process? Like, what tools does he use?
Yeah, well, he said that generally his approach to game soundtracks is collaborative,
Okay.
but the specifics depend on the game.
Okay.
Some developers have a very clear idea of what they want.
Right.
Others are more open to suggestions.
So it's really tailored to the project then?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So, we were talking about his studio setup in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
His main sequencer was Logic Pro,
Okay.
and then he would also use Ableton Live or Reason for sound design and looping.
So that's like the software side of things then?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And he was moving more and more toward working within the box.
All right.
He converted all of his hardware samplers to virtual instruments
Okay.
so he could do everything in the computer.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it gave him a lot more control
Yeah.
and it really sped up his workflow.
Okay.
And he had a, really cool studio set up
Oh, yeah.
designed by studio consultants.
Oh, wow.
He's got Mackie control surfaces, Cine keyboard controller, Quested speakers, and Presonus monitoring.
Wow. He's got the whole setup.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive.
Nice.
But, it's interesting to contrast that with the tools he was using back when he was doing the original Fallout and Fallout 2.
Oh, yeah. I'm curious about that because it was a very different time.
Yeah, he was using an NED Synclavier.
A synclavier. Okay.
Yeah, which is a digital synthesizer and sampler that was really popular in the late 20th century.
Okay.
And he would use that to control a bunch of external MIDI synthesizers.
Like what kind?
He had a Nord 2 Ovaris, a PPG 2.3, a Roland Jupiter 6, and an EMU Morpheus.
Okay.
And the Morpheus was really interesting because it had this kind of unique way of doing sound design.
Oh, yeah.
And he used it to create those clangy metal sounds
Oh, yeah.
and those strange ambiances
Mm-hmm.
that are so iconic in the Fallout games.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was a really cool setup.
Wow. So it was like a lot more hands-on
Oh, yeah, very hands-on.
back then, I imagine.
Yeah, he was tweaking knobs and, programming these synths. It was a lot of work.
Yeah, I bet.
But the results speak for themselves.
Right, right. And then it wasn't just the synths themselves, right?
No.
It was how he used them.
Yeah, he would blend traditional sources with synthesis and resampling,
Okay.
and then he would process the heck out of everything
Oh, wow.
to get the sounds he wanted.
So it's a very deliberate sound then.
Oh, yeah, very deliberate.
Okay.
Especially for Fallout, he was really trying to blend odd ethnic and industrial sound design
Oh, wow.
into something that was emotional and musical.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So when it came to actually working on those early Fallout games,
Right.
we talked about how he joined those projects kind of late in the process.
Yeah, he often did.
And the timelines were really compressed.
They were, yeah.
Planescape, Torment in particular, he only had about 2 weeks to do the entire score.
That's crazy.
I know.
That's just wild.
2 weeks for that massive game. Yeah, and that's a game that people still talk about the music for.
Oh, absolutely.
So for Fallout, he said that the developers at Interplay sent him some music
Yeah.
as like a demo,
Yeah, as a reference.
as a reference point.
Yeah.
But they didn't tell him who it was by.
Right.
And so he later found out that it was similar to Aphex Twin.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because he wasn't familiar with Aphex Twin at the time.
Right.
So it's kind of cool that he was like unknowingly influenced by Aphex Twin.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird coincidence.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
And then for Fallout, the developers were very specific about what they wanted.
Yeah, they wanted it to be ambient, cold, dark, desolate.
Okay.
Really reflect the world of the game.
Yeah.
And they had ideas for specific sounds for different areas.
Okay.
So it was a very collaborative process.
Yeah.
In terms of, really nailing down that specific sound.
And it's also interesting how he ended up reusing some music
Yeah.
from older projects.
Yeah, like from Netstorm.
Netstorm.
Okay.
Yeah, sometimes he would take like a fragment of something
Okay.
and then rework it into something new.
And that was probably partly because of the time constraints, right?
Yeah, probably partly time, partly because the producers just liked those pieces.
Okay, so they were like, hey, we like that. Use that again.
Right, exactly.
So then let's fast forward a bit.
Okay.
He came back to game music, several years later.
He did, yeah.
With games like Need for Speed,
Mm-hmm.
Shift,
Yeah.
and Prey 2.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that those games kind of reignited his passion for game music.
They did, yeah.
Which is cool.
Yeah.
And then he went on to do Wasteland 2.
Yes.
And Torment, Tides of Numenera.
Mm-hmm.
So he's kind of returned to his roots a little bit.
He has, yeah.
Which is really awesome.
Yeah.
And for Wasteland 2.
Right.
Which is, very much in the same vein as Fallout.
It is, yeah.
He originally thought that the music would be even more minimal than Fallout.
Right, even more ambient, colder, desolate.
Okay.
But he actually ended up going in a slightly different direction.
He did. Yeah, he decided to go with a more aggressive, harsher,
Okay.
almost disorienting sound.
Okay, why was that?
He felt like it fit the world of the game better.
Okay.
It was a very brutal dystopian world.
Okay.
And he wanted the music to reflect that.
Okay, so it was more about setting the tone and the mood then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, he wanted it to feel almost uncomfortable at times.
Wow. Okay.
In contrast to the Fallout music, which was more tame and almost calming in a way.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And he really tailored the music to the different environments in the game.
He did, yeah.
Like in the Arizona desert areas.
Yeah.
It's very open, desolate, decayed.
Mm-hmm.
And he uses these long metal ambiances, distorted drones.
Yeah.
And then for Los Angeles, it gets a lot more glitchy and electronic.
Yeah, much more harsh.
Okay.
With distorted tones, percussion, and radio voices.
Wow. Okay. And then he even went a step further and created specific sounds for different factions within the game.
He did, yeah.
So it's really a very nuanced and detailed approach.
It is, yeah. He really went all out.
Wow.
Yeah.
And he talked about how Wasteland 2 being a Kickstarter project meant that there were some budgetary constraints.
There were, yeah.
So he couldn't create as much music as he wanted to.
Right. He said that the amount of gameplay kind of outpaced the amount of music he could create.
Okay.
So they did add more tracks, especially for combat.
Okay.
But there was still a lot of the game that was just ambient soundscapes.
Right. And that's a challenge with those big open world games, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, how do you create enough music to fill all that space?
Exactly.
And so finally, I want to talk a little bit about the advice that he's given for aspiring composers.
Yeah.
Because he's been doing this for so long.
Right.
He's obviously seen a lot.
Yeah.
And so he said that if you love composing and you feel compelled to do it, just do it. Don't let anything stop you.
Absolutely. If you're passionate about it, go for it.
Yeah. And he said there's no single path to success.
Right.
Which is true.
Yeah, there's no magic formula.
Yeah.
It's really about setting goals and being mindful of the choices you make.
Right. So it's like, are you doing things that are going to help you in the long run?
Exactly.
Or are you just kind of like spinning your wheels?
Yeah.
Okay.
And he also said that, the music business can be unpredictable.
Oh, yeah.
Especially in TV, film, and games.
Right.
Sometimes the music is a small part of the overall story.
Yeah, and I think that's important to remember for anyone
You
going
think?
into this. It's not always about being the star of the show.
Right.
It's about contributing to something bigger than yourself.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this dive into the work of Mark Morgan,
Yeah.
it's really clear that his approach to ambient music
Yeah.
is just so unique and so effective.
It is, yeah.
And it's really had a huge impact on video game music.
Dick.
His ability to create those emotional connections with players
Mm-hmm.
in games like Fallout and Planescape, Torment,
Yes.
it's really special.
It is, yeah.
And so for anyone listening who wants to get into game music,
Yeah.
find your own voice experiment with sound, understand the emotional goals of the project,
Mm-hmm.
and just don't give up.
Yeah, keep going.
Mark Morgan's journey is a great example of that.
It is.
He didn't take the traditional path,
Right.
but he ended up creating something truly amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as a final thought here,
Right.
think about how diverse Mark Morgan's musical background was.
Yeah.
From classical piano to rock bands to TV scores,
Yeah.
how it all came together
Mm-hmm.
to shape his work in video games.
Right.
So what unconventional paths can you explore?
Yeah.
What seemingly unrelated experiences can you draw on
Mm-hmm.
to bring something unique to your own music?
It's all about finding those connections.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, that's it for today.
All right.
Thanks for listening.